conditions. Mining, as you can see here, chained, working in a hole, digging underground in very dangerous conditions, working in mines. And the Romans wanted a lot of marble, gold, silver, iron for their weapons, for their temples, for their statues, and building these massive cities. And well, that all that stone, all that metal had to come from somewhere, and it usually was on the backs of slaves who were worked to the death. Speaking of working to death, for many slaves, their job was to make death. Here we see a Roman gladiator fight, and we see there's a lot of people on the ground there not doing so well. And this last survivor, you can see the gladiator looking up to the crowd, looking up to the wealthy patricians. You can see the emperor is over there, and they're looking to see if they're saying to spare the person's life or to let them live. We'll talk more about gladiator battles in a bit in the next unit, but I want to talk about a particular gladiator, and that is a guy by the name of Spartacus. I am Spartacus. It's a movie reference. Many slaves in Rome, as mentioned, were treated horribly, and if you were a gladiator whose job was to kill and kill and kill until you were killed in a brutal, horrible fashion while people laughed and joked while it was going on, probably you had a pretty rough life. And Spartacus is a former soldier. He was from what we would today most likely call from the area of present-day Turkey or Bulgaria, near Asia Minor. And he was enlisted in the Roman army when they were conquered, but then he deserted. And his punishment for leaving the legion was that he was sold to a slaver. Since he was a criminal, that was his punishment. And since he was an experienced soldier, he was sold to a gladiator. If you were a gladiator, you went to a gladiator school where you basically trained in fighting 24/7. Your whole life was preparing for gladiator combat, and then people would bet on you in combat. If you proved yourself to be a really good gladiator, you might work your way up to working in the Colosseum. Spartacus uses his military experience, his leadership ability, to convince the other gladiators that are there to overthrow their school and to kill the people who own them. And now, since this is a school, they take all the weapons and they start arming not only themselves, but slaves in the countryside. Not just slaves that were working as gladiators, but we see peasants that were working in the farms, slaves that were working in the mines, slaves leaving their house because that working in households because they want to be free. Slaves from all over the place are coming in droves to this guy, Spartacus, who is arming them and training them. And many of them are untrained, and Spartacus is able to take this untrained army and lead it against this, at that time, the best army in the world. Multiple times his army is able to beat Roman legions, often surprising them, rewriting the playbook. Spartacus is a lot of George Washington in him in that way, that he's going up against a much larger foe who was oppressing him, and he using cunning, trickery, ambushing, guerrilla tactics. They're able to just wreak havoc on the Romans. For 2 years, they're getting close to, by the time the second year of fighting is done, his army is over 100,000 people, and they're pushing on Rome itself. Unfortunately for Spartacus, his army almost gets too big to manage. There's a lot of dispute, and because there was, he ran it a lot much more democratically, they couldn't come to an agreement. They probably could have taken the opportunity and fled through the Alps into the Germanic states, which the Romans had a lot less control of and lived free, but they decided to start moving south into Italy, And here now we're going to see the two consuls of Rome. You might remember these two names from when we talked about Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus. They lead 8 full legions. They basically drove all Roman forces from the empire back into Italy to crush this revolt. And bit by bit by bit, Spartacus's slave army gets worn down more and more and more until they're finally pushed to what, if you remember Italy being a toe, a foot, into the toe of that foot. There, Spartacus's army makes its last stand. Spartacus himself almost makes it to Crassus, charging through the crowd, leaping, before unfortunately he is cut down by his centurions and is killed in battle. And without Spartacus's leadership, the army falls apart. And to make an example of the to the slaves who revolted, to show any other slave that they should that they shouldn't think of this, just to show you how brutal the Romans can be, they took 6,000 of the slaves that were still alive when they were captured and crucified them along the Appian Way, their main road on the Italian peninsula. So you would travel from Rome all the way to the southern end of Italy, and see the hanging bodies on crosses of these former slaves who served in Spartacus's army. And we're going to see that there won't be as many slave revolts after Spartacus. Despite his success, the horror of what fell his army afterwards definitely deterred a lot of people from revolting. Spartacus, if you look him up, he's been adapted into a lot of different books and movies. Gladiator is an exact version of Spartacus, was inspired by it. But my favorite, the old one from the 60s, I Am Spartacus. But lots of he's been serving as an inspiration to many with his story for more than 2,000 years. So, question for the lessons. 1, was the life of most Roman slaves the same? Explain your answer. And second follow-up question, since we talked about him a bit, give me your own explanation of who was Spartacus and why was he important. Thanks for watching, 6th graders.